Hello again, this is Liam O'Mara, we're going to be talking here with Jason Kishineff for the Independent Democrats. We want to see who he is, where he stands, and what's going on there. So, Jason, tell us who you are and why you're running for office.
Well, my name is Jason Kishineff. This is actually my third run. I am an angry voter who's dissatisfied with our corporate-owned Congress, blocking all progressive change. I ran for the first time in 2018 with the Green Party, and then my opponent, Mike Thompson, refused debate, and so I ran as a Democrat in 2020 to try to force some debate at the Democratic Club level, but he just sent surrogates to the debates who lied through their teeth and said, actually, they may not even have known they were lying, but they lied and they said that he doesn't take corporate money because that's illegal, which is totally false, as we all know.
Yeah.
And even one of the questions that the surrogate was asked was, you take a bunch of money from PG&E, how are you going to handle this topic? And she just stood by it and said, I don't know what you're talking about. Mike doesn't take corporate money. And they get away with that at the Democratic Club level. He still gets most of the endorsement votes, even though here I am saying, you're taking all this money and you're not putting forward any of this progressive policy. And that was at the Progressive Democrats of Benicia meeting. So I was really surprised by that. I have left the Democratic Party. I'm running as an independent now. I did want to be with the People's Party, but they didn't achieve ballot access. So can't run as a Green because they're backing mandates and Howie Hawkins, and I just can't get on board with them anymore at this point. Some of the local issues that I'm dealing with are we've got a board of supervisors that runs the county that's backed by billionaire winery owners that are paying the supervisors to allow them to deforest our hillsides to build more and more wineries. We have almost 800 wineries, and they're having a hard time even putting a cap on the number of wineries because they want to put it forward as a right that their children should be able to start new wineries.
Right.
And,
yeah.
And totally denying that there's any science to back up that cutting down trees is going to contribute to climate change. I mean, it's just the most. I don't want to insult them. I'm just going to leave it at that. You can judge their argument for yourself.
No, that's honestly a fun one. I mean that trees absorb carbon is like 6th grade science.
Right.
So I mean, that's a new low. No, it doesn't make any difference at all because obviously grapevines do all the same work trees do. What?
Right. And I mean, at these meetings, you'll get hundreds of people, and all kinds of people will speak out against these people, and they've got to have seating in extra rooms because there's not enough room for everybody, and they still go, geez, we got to figure out how to protect development here. And it's like, right. I just want to pull out my hair.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's anything that comes up here in talking about your previous runs and having run as a Green, as a Democrat, and now as an independent.
Yep.
What the key issue in the whole independent Democrats thing is if we're going to back any kind of Democrat running, they have to be willing to hold their own party accountable. Now, my perspective on it is, I don't care what the party is as long as somebody is pursuing good policy and if they can get in. There are independents who do get elected in this country, and we tend to forget that. There's not very many, and it's very difficult. But oftentimes in the more rural districts, it's easier to do that. The party infrastructure tends to be a bit weaker there.
Which is interesting. It's interesting that you say that because you wanted me to talk about how redistricting affected our district.
Yeah,
and
sure.
This was District 5,
mm-hmm.
And what they did was they cut off the southern end of the district, which was all far more left-leaning than the rest of the district, mm-hmm. And they added on a lot of rural area, and a lot of it is, technically more conservative they're really fed up with Democrats for sure. But I was gathering my ballot signatures out there, and there's farmers agree with a lot of
Mhm.
these positions. They
Right.
want good education, they want health care, they want people
Right.
to be able to earn a decent living. Yeah.
Yeah, it's often the labels that are the most problematic, and we've got so much propaganda built around the labels and creating kind of like political tribalism, which only serves the interests of the major parties. And people forget that coming out of a more socially conservative milieu does not in any way mean you can't back literally socialist policies. Actual Marxists used to take 20% of the vote in Oklahoma, a century ago. We've completely forgotten that history. Or go back to like the People's Party in the late 19th, 20th century there. The progressive populist movement was extremely popular among rural people. And it was calling for all the same kind of stuff that like the Bernie-crats and socialists are calling for today.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
I think realistically, if we can cut the bullshit, get people to take you seriously as an individual and talk about the issues. I know I found a lot of I found great success actually talking to tons of independent and even conservative voters, even Republicans who were like, you know what? I mean, I kind of agree on that. I don't like the party and all the bullshit there that comes out of Washington. I'm like, yeah, I agree. Most of them are assholes, but I want to get in and make a difference for us. And so I'm glad, regardless of any party, I'm glad to see anybody getting in for the right reasons.
Oh, thank you.
So that's a good question there too, sort of a segue. I did see, and I remember we seeing this and talking a bit about it, that you had supported Bernie's initial run there. Is that part of the reason that you jumped in 2018?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I followed Bernie Sanders, and he was calling for people to run for office and calling for a constitutional amendment outlawing corporate money in our political system. And so I, optimistically thought I actually had a chance as a green. But yeah, I
I
mean,
feel you there.
that was, I'm like, well, I have time to do this. I can do this, put it together. And I see all the people are rising up for Bernie and they're going to support me. And yeah, it didn't work out quite so idealistically, but the struggle continues, as it were.
Absolutely. Yeah, the whole question of green politics has always sort of fascinated me. I was a green for most of 20 years. I would bounce into the Dems during the primaries so I could pick the least bad candidate because I knew that we'd be stuck with one of them anyway. Bounce back
Yeah.
into the Greens because I couldn't stand being associated with a party that since the late 80s has so embraced corporate money and become a literal conservative, corporate party. And we've sort of lost that. And I think so many of the voters within the party, so much of the party faithful, they're much farther left than their politicians. And it pains me constantly to point out, you're actually voting for literal far rightists in a sense. I mean, pro-state authoritarian figures who are like way down with corporate capitalism and basically farther to the right than the Republican Party was in the 1960s.
Yeah,
So
totally.
we've
I
we've
was
really
just,
lost sight of that.
I was just, I was trying to prepare myself. I went to an anti-mandate protest, and I was trying to prepare myself for some kind of spurious debate with some of the my right-leaning friends. And I was preparing myself by looking at what some of these tax rates were. And like the tax rate under Eisenhower was like 81% on
Mhm.
the hot top tier.
Effectively, I mean, it actually was it was higher than that, but you get enough write-offs and whatnot that the effective rate was in the 70s or 80s, which is fantastic. I mean, I think the top rate was like 91% at one point, but no one was
Right.
actually paying that much.
Right.
What people often forget is that the higher rates encourage reinvestment in the real economy.
Yes.
Lower rates mean you just sock it into the Cayman Islands and keep it for yourself because there's
And
no reason to reinvest
and
it.
and you could plainly see where Reagan cutting the tax rate from like 70% to like 35%
Mhm.
means we have half as much money.
Yeah, and it's not just
It's really clear. It's really obvious.
yeah, and not even just half the money too. That's one of the things that I think I've struggled the most to help people understand is it's that it changes the incentive structure. So
Yes.
not only does it cut money out of government, because somebody can say, well, I think that's good. You cut money out of, okay, fine, let's go with that. What it also does is it changes the way that the businesses themselves operate. They stop giving money to their workers, they stop investing in new locations here, and they start finding ways to just play the markets. Back in the 60s, when we
That's
still had
true.
high corporate tax rates, 90% of what happened in the stock market actually reflected the real economy. And today it's almost entirely speculation. It's just people making money out of nothing for themselves. And it does nothing for us at all. They're investing, it's basically, we've legalized gambling for them. And they can take the
Right.
proceeds, sock it into their offshore accounts. And not only does government not get anything, but our wages go down.
Yeah. Right.
It's a
Like like Lee Camp says, it's a giant Ponzi scheme.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And I found, and I wonder if this is something similar that you found. I found that talking to more rural voters about things like that, when you actually talk about um, the way that the businesses are actually screwing us out, rather than government, kind of taking it out of that, because a lot of Democrats want to talk about, oh, we want the higher taxes so the government can spend things. And a lot of conservatives are not really convinced about that. But they do want higher wages for their family. They do want better benefits for their family. And if you show them the declining wages relative to productivity and how much more of it is being concentrated, I find that actually makes some sense.
Yeah. And they definitely see that corporations are running everything. At least a lot of them do. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's honestly one of the things that is both terrifying and brilliant about the whole Steve Bannon approach there. I mean, the basically shifting the Republican Party into overtly neo-fascist territory is that now I repeatedly see Republicans attacking corporations. They're all attacking big pharma and attacking the banks. I'm like, are you kidding me? We've been attacking them forever, and you've been deregulating everything to give them power, and now you're complaining about the power they have. But what it does is it shows to me the opportunity that Democrats gave up on decades ago. Those were the natural voters that we could have had, and instead you're handing them to actual fascists.
Yeah. Well, the Democrats are actual fascists these days.
There's
They
many
are.
issues. It's
I mean, the establishment
difficult to
Democrats,
find the
they are
difference.
all taking the corporate money.
Mhm.
They're all promoting
Right.
censorship, and it's a pretty scary world right now.
It honestly really is. And this is one of the reasons that I want to see more people running either as independents or as very independent minded Dems or whatever, is the ability to push back against that concentration of corporate power. Because if we don't seize that ground, that's where these right populists are going to show up, and they're going to scoop up those voters along with the existing conservative base because of all the social issues or whatever they can play on. And it's a losing game for us. Democrats for a long time have been pointing to demography as if that's going to solve everything, as if they can just count on voters of color continually coming out for them. And we've seen, I mean, look at between his two runs, Trump's support among American Hispanics went up, not down.
Yep.
And the Democrats can't really explain that. They just go I don't know, and it's kind of obvious why.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a real opportunity, I think, to get in there and to try to hold people accountable, to push back on the terrible social policies Republicans have, but the terrible economic policies Democrats have.
And the surprising, or not surprising, but the stark absence of voices speaking out against imperialism and the
Mhm.
military industrial complex. Like even Bernie Sanders is, really
Yeah,
hands tied when he says it. He doesn't want to cut the military budget by 50%. He wants to cut it by 10%. It's like,
yeah.
come
Yeah,
on.
exactly. And that's honestly one of the most brilliant moves that the military industrial complex took, was to spread the jobs as far across the country as they could. So anybody standing up saying we need to cut the budget has to explain to their voters why less money is going to come in.
Yeah.
And it's really kind of insidious. I mean, the fact that we were talking about this all the way back in 1960, and all we've done is let it get steadily worse. I mean, oh, holy shit. Did you see they leaked some of the discussions about Biden's proposed budget next time around, and he
No.
wants even more money for the military, and still can't push any of the social policies.
Of course he does.
we're getting to practically almost $1 trillion a year. I mean, when the starting budget, when the base budget is 770 billion, which is what they're proposing,
Yeah,
plus
the base
there's a
budget.
ton of subsidiary spending bills for ongoing conflicts and wars and whatnot here that they don't count into the military budget. $1 trillion a year?
Yeah.
That's corporate welfare.
Yes,
Okay, so good segue in terms of like the whole imperialism part, right?
Okay.
Because personally, I love seeing people run on this and talk about it because it's sadly under discussed in American politics. The consultants are always like, oh, don't talk foreign policy. Americans don't care. They don't care. They don't care. And okay, yeah, but some people do care. And
there is some real truth to that.
A lot there is, but there's a lot of younger voters do care. And if you want to excite people who don't normally vote, I found the fact that I took a lot of positions because I come at this as a historian, and foreign policy is one of the first things that got me interested in history. I found a ton of voters asking me questions about the Arab uprisings, about the situations with Russia or China, the Israel-Palestine conflict. They wanted to know. The older voters, they don't care. But a lot of the people that we need to draw out that aren't normally engaged, they really care about U.S. empire. So what are some of the issues that come up that stand out for you in that, if you're a critic of American imperialism?
Well, the most obvious thing that stands out is the Joe Biden's effort to make war with Russia and Ukraine, or Antony Blinken and Jake Sullivan's effort to make war. Because I'm not sure Biden's really knows what the hell's going on anymore.
Who knows? Yeah, at this point, who really knows?
Yeah, I mean, started under Obama. They couped Ukraine. They installed a literal Nazi as the president, and they've been training Nazi militias to kill Russians for years. And the area of Ukraine has tried to separate from Ukraine because they didn't want any part of it, but the U.S. has urged them to try to retake that's what it appears to me, because they shelled them yesterday. Although you don't hear about it in the news, I noticed. They cover every aspect of everything going on in Ukraine except when U.S.-backed forces bomb them. So, yeah, it seems to me that the U.S. is trying to encourage Ukraine to reclaim their territory, and they're doing it in this way that they think that Vladimir Putin is not going to be able to try to stop them. And I think that is why Vladimir Putin decided to recognize them today as independent territories, so that he can call them Russia's allies, and maybe get involved, which is like what we're trying to avoid here.
Yeah.
And the U.S. government is so full of shit because they keep stirring this up. They've been stirring it up for more than a year. They've been conducting these military exercises just off the coast of Russia to antagonize a Russian buildup. And then they finger pointed and said, look, Russia's building up troops. They're going to invade. It's all the U.S. that has done this.
Yeah, and it reminds me a lot of the situation around Georgia too, because you had a government in there that was suddenly very favorable to joining NATO, which then puts another NATO member right on Russia's borders. Which again, if the whole point of NATO was to prevent further war, during the Cold War context, end of the Soviet Union, and really realistically end of the Cold War while Reagan and Gorbachev were around, what's the point of NATO anymore? But it still continues to expand. There's more U.S. bases spreading all across Eastern Europe. The more countries that join, it's more countries that can buy our weapons. So it feeds the military industrial complex here. So it just becomes a giant cash cow. But what it does is it backs Russia more and more into a corner.
It's an anti-Russia alliance.
Yeah, and the problem there about talking about it that I find for a lot of people is that, it's sort of like this weird binary thinking. If you talk about it, the mistakes the U.S. is making and the moves that we're doing there, then it sounds suddenly like you're defending Putin. I think the Ukrainians are honestly a good example of that. A ton of the separatist movements are themselves far-right white supremacists, but so are the people we're backing. So it's like, choose your Nazi, and we're supposed to be happy with that. Like, oh, we want the pro-NATO Nazis versus the pro-Russian. I mean, it's not like this is a very clear, cut and dry, good or bad guy here. And it's sort of similar to me to, I guess, the Russian position. Wow, it just reminds me so. How often has the U.S. actually intervened to carve up countries too? I mean, the situation that they did with by recognizing Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Georgia, or now Luhansk and Donetsk in Ukraine. What about the whole like North and South Vietnam crap? We
What
sabotaged the Geneva Accord that would have created a unified independent country and instead propped up a dictatorship in one part of it.
just in the last administration, Donald Trump didn't start any new wars, but he sure as hell recognized Syria and Golan Heights as part of Israel. What the
Right.
hell?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, hell, my God, that the
And he gave the Syrian border to Turkey.
well, yeah, absolutely greenlit an invasion and gave up our support for the Kurds in that region, which just feeds into Turkish, domestic politics. They want to
Right.
like beat the drum against Kurds because of their own long-running insurgency. The Syrian Kurds have nothing to do with that, but they suffer, for our hubris and the Turks there. But gosh, I mean, we constantly turn our backs on a lot of these foreign policy issues, and I find it's really difficult to get a lot of Americans to care about them. I've tried to point out the whole moving of the embassy thing, and so many people just don't understand why that's a problem. I mean, there's literally a UN Security Council resolution saying it's illegal for any country to have their embassy there because Israel annexed a huge chunk of territory that wasn't part of Jerusalem and calls it Jerusalem. So if we put anything there, it implicitly recognizes that land grab. No
Yes.
country has formally recognized that land grab. By moving our embassy there, we kind of now have. And I don't think people really understand the implications of that.
And no, they don't at all. And they like our government makes these performative statements about both sides of them as, oh yeah, Israel has a right to do this to defend itself or whatever, and yeah, we think that Palestinians have a right to live too, but we keep funneling money into Israel to commit these atrocities against the Palestinian people.
Yeah, and
So
somehow any criticism of that policy gets trotted out as anti-Semitism, and this is honestly as
yes, it
true of
does.
Democrats as it is of Republicans. There's just constant attacks on this, as if somehow government policy is connected to race. I mean, it's essentially a racist argument to say that it could be anti-Semitic in the first place when we're talking about direct government policy. The simple fact is the Likud party that Netanyahu was part of, the former party that was in power, literally traces its roots into the late 20s, early 30s as a fascist movement. It's
Yeah.
always been a far right ethno-national movement, and it is still, the party is officially committed to annexing the West Bank. And
and
we're
is
supposed to say
and
that's okay?
and is committed to no Palestinian state ever existing, which is
Right.
contrary to Israel's agreements. And it's not
Well,
the only fascist
yeah.
Israeli party.
No, I mean we now have a prime minister who's literally from a settler party, and you're supposed to think we're going to get some peace negotiations out of that.
Right.
I
Right.
mean the whole like peace process is essentially a charade intended to drag this out so that they can continue to plant more and more settlements in the area and make any kind of self-determination impossible.
Yeah.
What frustrates me is that Democrats used to be able to take the moral high ground on issues like this. I really remember the fights and this, we had, all across the 70s and 80s, they were pushing back against apartheid in South Africa. And Reagan and the Republicans were like hardcore for the South African government. But on the Israel issue, everyone is okay with ethno-nationalism and everyone is okay with depriving people of rights. And what Israel is doing in the West Bank is essentially creating like the Bantustans in South Africa, little tiny cantonments, disconnected from anybody else, where
Yep.
there's massive checkpoints and constant harassment to get from one place to another. And most Israelis don't even know this. Most Israelis never see it, much less Americans. We don't have a single journalist on the ground.
Right.
So people are like, oh yeah, I'm pro-Israel because they mean like they're okay with Jewish people. Well, great,
Right.
that's fine. We're talking about a country's actual policies, not about, I mean, Zionist and Jew are different things.
Right, exactly. I am an anti-Zionist Jew,
Yeah.
and like almost all of my family is Zionist, even my family members who recognize that the Israeli government is brutal. does some brutal things, they still have to finish every sentence with, but Israel still has a right to exist.
Right.
It's like, no country has a right to exist, not like that, if it's up to the people that live there, right?
Well, even there is, as far as I can tell, and this is something that constantly frustrates me. People seem to think that any criticism is delegitimizing the state. The state exists,
Right.
fait accompli. It will exist as long as people want it to exist.
As long as people want it to exist.
Right. And
Exactly.
if you follow their own policies, if you follow their own logic to its conclusion, it will eventually disintegrate because the demography will end up destroying it. As long as they keep holding that land, eventually you get to be massively outnumbered by Palestinians. All they have to do is sit down, and you end up with something like South Africa. If you want a Jewish state to exist, you need to get them to change the policies. But people don't seem to understand that. They just want to, like, okay, Israel should exist. Okay, cool, fine. Israel should exist. But should it be doing this, that, or that? And that gets a lot harder. People, we're willing to give them billions a year to fund settlements and the aggressive policing of settlements. And people want to completely plug their ears about the consequences of that.
Yeah. And because of the separation, especially because of highways and stuff, like, you don't even see it a lot of times. And so, and they don't allow, the Israeli government, if you're coming there to expose this stuff, they don't even allow you in the country. American Jews, they don't even hear about it. And if they do hear about it, they automatically disqualify anybody that says anything against Israel as anti-Semitic. And then they say, next time they hear something from that person, they say, oh, well, that's a well-known anti-Semitic person.
Right. Yeah, I I don't even remember how many times I've been detained and strip searched in Israel. I have a nice record with Shin Bet just for walking around because they know I'm a historian. They don't want us there documenting what happens. And you're right about the bypass roads. I've been on both roads. On the bypass roads, you have no idea you've passed from Israel across the Green Line to the settlements. It's just a nice little freeway, zips around, nothing seems to change. On the roads Palestinians can be on, holy shit, that's different. And the lived experience, the lived reality of taking hours to get just a couple of miles because you're constantly being stopped and harassed and searched and treated like everyone is a terrorist. That's what it builds, a kind of resentment that ultimately leads to the violence that they want.
Yeah. And they could use that to justify more aggression.
Yeah.
and then when Hamas shoots some rockets at the Iron Dome that mostly gets shot down, they say, look, Hamas is trying to kill all the Jews.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the same thing that sort of supports the military-industrial complex here and so many other issues. It just creates a kind of like self-fulfilling cycle. It just keeps perpetuating itself, where nothing actually can improve for ordinary people. You're just stuck on this wheel going around and around.
Very much.
That's a good one, actually, because I'd love to ask your perspective on policing and on militarized policing, because to me, I see a very, very similar logic. And it doesn't surprise me that in the US, we've increasingly been using like Israeli security consultants in areas, because people will point to crime. Hey, crime is bad. And they'll say, okay, let's put more police out to prevent the crime. Despite the fact that police don't actually prevent crime, they just arrest people after the fact and give them more and more military equipment. So now it's almost like you're living under some kind of military occupation in certain parts of this country. And then, when the crime doesn't get any better, you just keep throwing more money at it.
Yep. That is the case in Vallejo, which is like a 2 minutes walk from where I live. And it used to be in my district, but is no longer in my district, but it's still my community. Yeah. And there have been, I think, 38 unarmed people killed by police in the last like 20 years. And the police keep getting raises. Mm-hmm. And the city council can't really do much about it because of the contracts that the police union has negotiated with them. And the DA, who used to have a Blue Lives Matter and symbol on her icon on Facebook, looks at, video. You can watch a video and it's horrible. You're watching somebody get murdered. And she just says, oh, no, that was justifiable in the course of duty. And nothing ever happens.
Yeah, I
But
honestly,
we did just get a new police chief
oh,
like about a year and a half ago, and a couple of those officers have been terminated, but there's still like a dozen there who have multiple kills under their belt. They have bent the tips of their badges to mark their kills. One of them even went off to teach at the police academy in Napa, and so other cops are learning from that psychopath.
at least you managed to replace a chief there. I mean, redistricting changes everything, whatever. I mean, the district I was in before in Riverside County, wow, I mean, the sheriff there was an admitted paying member of like Oath Keepers. I mean,
Wow.
and there's a lot of that connection and constant defense of this in both Riverside and San Bernardino County. We have pretty high rates of police violence against unarmed people. And it's always fascinated me
Yep.
that we can oppose ordinary people killing each other, but if the state does it, that's somehow okay. To me, it like brings back, I don't know, it brings me back to my childhood and reading like old, like the little 2000 AD Judge Dredd comics that used to be around. And like,
Right.
okay, when the police officer is judge, jury, and executioner, and it's like you almost aiming for, and there's like a bipartisan consensus aiming us toward a kind of Judge Dredd future where you don't actually get your day in court. If the police think you did something, it's okay if they shoot you. And
Right.
we don't even question it if they're running, you shoot them in the back, they're running away. They're clearly not a threat to anybody at that point. Then
There's
apprehend
this
them later.
there's a
Why shoot
supreme
them?
there's a Supreme Court decision that justifies police officers shooting somebody in the back if they're running away because that person may be dangerous running into a population.
Oh,
And so
yes.
they get away with that crap.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I mean, it's the most vicious kind of authoritarianism. And I think that in terms of the voting people, in terms of the voting public, there's a lot of people out there who are uncomfortable with that level of power being used against us. And
Yeah.
yet the parties themselves, always seem to circle the wagons around these issues and no one wants to criticize it.
And it's hard because there are some cities that have like their police departments are totally riddled with this kind of murderous corruption, like Vallejo is, like Portland is, like Chicago is, or Minneapolis, Bakersfield. But then in other cities, like in Napa, the police departments, I mean, they have some complaints, but it's nothing like that. And
Right.
so that the people don't see it. And so you try to tell people cops can be really bad people, but they don't see any cops ever being really bad people. And then you get
Right.
labeled as anti-cop. And you're like,
Right.
no, you know what? Not every police department is equal here. This is,
Right.
this shit's going on. This is real
Yeah.
shit. I know people that have been seriously affected by this stuff.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So do I. And I just don't understand why this is so controversial. It's like just because you have a badge does not mean you're a necessarily good person or deserve the badge. And it's possible to have policing that isn't brutal. I mean, we used
Absolutely.
to have community policing where the police came out of the neighborhoods. They were familiar with people. They could walk by, hi, Joe, how's it going? Like, everyone, you're just walking the beats around there. Now they're just recruited anywhere. We're recruiting tons of ex-military people,
Yeah.
and it's a whole different ballgame. And we don't see how the systemic issues somehow affect the behavior and the way it treats ordinary people. It's not attacking every person who's a police officer or the profession as a whole when you're pointing to the systemic factors that are
Right.
making it violent in some areas.
Right. This one time for one of these posts I was putting together, I did this comparison and I added up the populations and the number of people that police had killed in the United Kingdom, Ireland, Spain, Portugal, France, Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and I think Poland, all put together was about the same population of the US. I think a little bit higher, a couple million higher. And police have killed 20 times as many people in the
Mhm.
United States as
Right.
in all those countries combined. And
Right. I mean,
it's totally systemic. In all those
mhm.
countries, they make more money to pay, a more appropriate wage to feed their families and keep a house over their head. They all have universal health care. They all have free college tuition. It's absolutely
And
systemic.
go figure, the crime rate goes down. You
Go
know,
figure.
I mean, if you actually take care of people, if you don't have to worry, I mean, if honestly, if I'm growing up in a situation where I can sweep the ground in a McDonald's or deal drugs, I mean,
I mean,
it's
those things
hard,
exist. You think there's not crime in Paris or London?
right?
No, of course
Right.
there are, but police kill a lot less people in those
Right. And
places.
there are fewer people that get involved in these things, and the criminals themselves are less violent because, you're actually taking care of a lot of the reasons that would draw people into it in the first place. It's simply less attractive. The US
Right.
does have a far higher rate of violent crime and a higher rate of police killings. So at the end of the day, you're sort of forced to ask yourself, are you Americans a uniquely awful people who just have to take the iron boot on the neck or something because we can't control ourselves? Or are there policy issues that we're neglecting and that somehow the rest of the world has figured out?
100%. You want to decrease crime, make sure that people have better educations, healthcare, and more money to feed their family and take vacations and just live their lives.
Absolutely. When you're starting job working at like a fast food place comes with a couple of weeks of paid vacation and $20 to $25 an hour wage, it's hard to think, why would I choose the risk of crime when I'm going to do all right? There's no place in this country that even on the local minimum wages, people can afford a two-bedroom apartment. Under California's minimum wage, you can't do it in much of this state.
Not in Napa County, you can't.
Yeah, it's people are being priced out of life, and you wonder why we have higher crime rates.
Yeah,
This is all policy
absolutely.
driven. I mean, like poverty, crime in the US is a policy choice. And one of the things that I want to ask people in general, anybody running for office, and one of the things I want to challenge the people who are in there for, if you love this country, why are you telling us that we are uniquely awful and deserve to be shot?
No
It's
shit.
clearly not patriotic to think that Americans are terrible people, but that's what you're arguing by saying, let's throw more money at the police because instead of solving the real problems.
Yeah, that's a really good take. I like that. But you reminded me of a thing I saw. I don't know if it's a meme. I don't know if that's the right word. But it was comparing the minimum wage here and the minimum wage in Denmark, and then went on to compare the price of a Big Mac here and the price of a Big Mac
Right.
in
And it's
Denmark.
lower
And the
there.
price of the Big Mac,
Yeah.
I think it was a 25 cents more. But it didn't go up to like $20, and that was the
Right.
point. Right?
In a lot of places, it's effectively lower.
Because the right wing criticism to the things we're talking about is that all that money must have to come from the government, and that means taxing the middle class, and you just want to destroy the. No.
Right.
It's the CEOs and the executive salaries. They're the ones, and
Right.
that's where all the money's going.
Right.
And all the corporate bailouts and tax breaks and all that bullshit.
Yep. Over and over, I see this, and not just from voters, they get it from their politicians. And that's another bipartisan consensus. Most Democrats and the Republicans are kind of in lockstep arguing that, any kind of changes like this is going to mean more taxes on the middle. And it really, if you look at even very high tax countries, if you look at the Swedes, if you look at the Danes, places that everyone looks as, oh yeah, their taxes are really, really high. Okay, no, they're not. If you look at the taxes and what they get for them, and then compare the cost for the same things here. What is the cost of healthcare in the US? What is the cost of childcare in the US? What is the cost of education? They are paying effectively a lower or the same tax rate we are. It works out to be the same basic 30-something% that everyone's paying here, and we get nothing for it but more guns. Meanwhile, they get a better life, lower crime, health. They live longer than we. Our lifespans are literally falling in the U.S. and have been for years.
That doesn't surprise me.
No, it doesn't. It shouldn't surprise people, but honestly, it terrifies me that people are so oblivious to this, and it's because the politicians don't want to talk about it. They want to keep dancing around these issues.
They don't want to talk about it because of their big donors. But the
Right,
healthcare system
exactly.
is falling apart. They're cutting beds in hospitals even as overcrowding goes on.
Right.
We are subsidizing crap food instead of healthy food. We're promoting oil pipelines all across our country so the Canadian companies can sell their oil.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, it's not a surprise at all.
Yeah, I think that's the real challenge for a lot of people running as kind of like insurgent campaigns when you're trying to reach out to voters, is to cut through some of the propaganda that gets people worried about their own tax rate. Because people do constantly. It's one of the things they worry about with Democrats in general because of the whole tax and spend idea,
Yep.
when realistically, there's no difference between the parties on that kind of crap. But this idea that actually addressing things for people like universal healthcare will be cheaper for people. We can absolutely afford higher education. No one's taxes have to go up because, again, we're paying the same tax rate as Danes do. The only people who are paying more taxes are corporations and the very wealthy. Go figure. I mean, so how did they get so many poor, ordinary people, workers, farmers, people all across this country to line up and defend billionaires' pocketbooks and agree with lowering their own wages? Because that's what we're doing.
Yes, it is what we're doing. It's terrible.
Yeah, I mean, but it really gets back to a core issue. I mean, one of the things that you say kind of got you in the first place, and one of the things that I've consistently liked about your campaign and many others, is the criticism of corporate money in our politics, the corrupting influence of money. So, do you have any thoughts you want to share on that corporate cash, how it affects your district, how it affects our country as a whole?
Oh man. Yeah. Right down the line. So let me start at the city council level. My congressman, the incumbent that I'm running against, he on like any issue, any local, even deforestation, doesn't even weigh in. That's a local issue. We got to stop this factory. It's going to pollute neighborhoods. That's a local issue. But the last city council election in Napa, he was out there knocking doors for this one city council candidate who was a former planning commissioner. And you know, she's just full on establishment Democrat. She's just like, she's being ushered into the club, right?
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't take stances on anything. So she was, what did she do? She cut loans for these development companies, and then was also a planning commissioner to approve them. I mean, it was just so gross. And so even at the lowest level, this is happening. I ran for
Right.
city council myself twice after I didn't pass the primaries. And in this last election, I had a guy from Atlanta, Georgia, dump like $10,000 into the city council race to every single candidate except me. And I'm like, wow, some developer from Atlanta, Georgia. We have a street named after him here. He's a developer. He's just extracting money from our community,
Right.
making these wine warehouses. That's all we have in our industrial sector practically is
Right.
wine warehouses. I mean, it's not all we have, but we have a ton of them.
Right. No,
Uh,
I feel you there.
I
There's a ton of that. Just our area is just filled with like distribution centers and whatnot because the rail
yeah
and truck lines all coming out of the port. So it's like, what? We're just like a dumping ground for all your stuff.
yeah,
You can't get any real development for us.
and I already touched on like the winery money that's
Mm-hmm.
affecting our board of supervisors here, and then at the at my opponent Mike Thompson, who I'm running against, he gets like almost $2 million a year in for election cycle for contributions, and almost all of that is corporate contributions. And he's getting money from weapons manufacturers and energy companies. He's taking money from Pfizer now. And it's just like the grossest thing, all these real estate companies and banks. And he makes these performative statements. Somebody told me I shouldn't use that word. I should use the word insincere because everything is performative. But he makes these insincere statements about how we should lower prescription drugs, and then he votes against an amendment to increase the list of lowered prescription drugs. And it's like he's such a dirty liar.
Yeah.
And it's all because of this corporate money. But you know what? When he gives speeches, he says we have to do everything we can to combat climate change. And so people like him because he doesn't say racist things, and he says he wants to combat climate change even though he consistently votes for military expansionism.
Mm-hmm.
And his big response for climate change was the Green Act, which gives tax incentives to companies to change. And I'm like, tax incentives? That's everything you can? You can't even stop taking fossil fuel money.
Right.
And
Yeah.
and people just like, oh well, no, I think you know what, tax incentives are. It's a historic change. It's historic because we haven't
Yeah.
done it before, but that doesn't make it strong.
What
That,
would be nice is seeing an actual like no fossil fuel money pledge, right?
right,
Or cutting
right,
through
but
that
he won't
corporate
do
cash
that.
out.
He
You
won't
know, I
do
mean,
that.
you can't say I'm all for combating climate change and then have no problem at all with massive deforestation and
Right,
money for like oil drilling off the coast or whatever. I mean,
right.
hello. I mean, Democrats want to line up and talk about energy independence and we can blah blah blah. We're an oil producer now. I'm like, and that's somehow good. Like, it's a good thing that we're cranking out more oil. How does this help anybody?
It's hard because when gas prices go up, people do legitimately hate that, and people do legitimately blame their politicians.
Yeah,
And what the hell are you doing? You need to,
right.
drill off the coast of California. And then the environmentalists kick in and like, what? Drill off the coast of California? I mean,
How does that help? I mean, it's like
but
people somehow think
realistically,
that more oil is going to lower the prices, and that's not really what drives the whole thing anyway.
no,
You know,
no,
I
and we're
do. I mean,
destroying our planet.
I understand that how much it hurts when the fuel prices go up. I understand people's opposition to gas taxes and whatnot there because we have to get around. The simple fact is, if we were paid a better wage, it wouldn't hurt the way it does. It
Right.
hurts so much because they're trying to keep us poor, which then again feeds into
100%.
this whole logic of where we're forced to then support the oil companies and more drilling and blah blah blah, which benefits us not at all, and in fact presents an existential threat. But we're supporting this stuff because oh yeah, the fuel price is going up by $1 a gallon. It hurts. I mean, it hurts me driving around.
It does, but I'd rather pay $1 a gallon more than destroy the planet, right?
I would too, but I
If
mean,
that's
it's
the
hard to.
choice,
I would too, but it's a lot harder to sell that idea. So,
yeah,
to me, it's more like, why don't we solve the real problems here? I mean, fuel prices are much higher in large parts of the world. I mean, driving around you can't drive into the city of London in cars most of the time. It's way too expensive.
yep,
Fuel prices are far higher in other
yeah.
places, but they have other ways around that. There's tons of other incentives that help. The pay for people is higher. Public transport infrastructure is much better. We don't have to deal with they don't have
Yeah,
to deal with the same kind of crap that we do. For us, it really bites into our
yeah,
pocketbooks.
yeah, and like you can't even suggest offering free public transport. What are you, a socialist? Yeah, I am.
I mean, it makes sense. I mean,
Yeah,
hello. I
doesn't
mean,
it though?
God, you can even make arguments. I mean, sure. I mean, okay, you can make a market socialist rationale for it. If people can get to their jobs more cheaply and very easily, if the goods can move much faster, it helps everybody. It helps your small businesses and everything else. But it's still
Yeah.
just no one
If
cares.
if
Our
there's less
transport
traffic and
infrastructure
people are,
is so antiquated in this country that it's just disgusting.
yeah,
It
yeah.
costs billions of dollars a year in lost productivity because everything takes so long to get from one place to the next. I
I'm
don't
sure
I
that's
understand how, like, I mean, God, for all the awful things that government does, I don't understand how. I mean, we're not talking about just how many high-speed rail lines the Chinese are laying out. By spending that money, they're helping everybody in the country and their economy. I mean, we've known for decades that
yeah.
infrastructure investments pay back 3 to 1 in productivity. It makes more money when you spend the money on it, but no one wants to spend the money.
And so yeah, but California did, and then they just kind of disappeared the money,
We
and
handed it over to corporations basically and let them screw us out of something. So we invested
exactly,
tons of money and we got squat for it. And then
exactly,
and then Newsom just folded up the whole thing. Like, are you
and
kidding me?
and that
Really?
gives the right the ability to say, look, you want to fund high speed rail? Look what a scam it is.
Exactly.
And,
Exactly. It's Democrats again and again falling for the right's rhetoric. It's basically like handing them on a silver platter. Here's how to beat us. This is what you
yes,
need to do. Point out that we can't do this. I
and
mean,
it's
if
all for
we just
profit.
did it right.
Yeah,
But instead we hand it over to corporations, let them screw everything up, and then we get nothing out of it except more support from Republicans. Just
right.
it's it's almost like they prefer Republicans win to actually solving the real problems.
Totally do. Totally do.
I love
Another
that. Oh,
another thing they do, and I know not all states have ballot measures, but our state does. I know you live in California.
yeah, yeah.
Um, So another thing they do is like they will just be inaction. They will not do anything to fix a problem. Like we've had our Highway 37, which has been threatened by sea level rise for years, but they just don't do anything. And so then that leaves it up to local municipalities or up to
Right.
the people to put forward a ballot measure to try to do it ourselves. And the way we have to do it is with bonds. And bonds are the worst way to pay for anything
Mm-hmm.
because you're paying out your ass for like 40 years in
Right.
property taxes.
Which is just another great scam to help the bankers while still screwing ordinary voters in California.
Exactamundo.
If we could just get Sacramento to do its job and DC to do its job, we wouldn't
Yes.
be so far in the red in California. We are massively in debt because of a lot of those bond measures, but we're forced to do it because the government won't solve basic problems for people.
Yes. Or, yeah, fully funding education. Why do we have to have school bonds?
Right.
Just fund education.
I mean, we've known for decades that the right loves, what we call like regulatory capture, whatever. They step in, they basically like put their own lobbyists in charge of departments, they run them into the ground, and then they point to that and say, look, they broke it, see, government is bad. And then
Yes, they
Democrats
do.
get in, they don't fix anything, they let it continue to run like shit. And then all it does is it feeds the right's argument that governments can never do anything right in the first place.
Democrats use that corporate capture to get their own policies, their own corruption through.
Yeah, they're get cash for
And
their
then
own
they
donors.
can say,
Mhm.
look, it was FDA approved or whatever.
Yeah, I love that you brought up local government, honestly, in talking about the corruption. And this is one of the things that I still really love about Bernie, because he's encouraged people not only to run for Congress but to run for tons of local offices.
Yeah.
And I think we've really neglected that. By the thing that most impacts a lot of ordinary people's lives is your city council, your county board of supervisors. It's all these levels of local government that really get to us, and yet we don't get involved, we don't run. And because in many places, and this is true in California, there's almost no spending cap on a lot of these lower offices and less regulation of the money coming in, which means that wealthy developers can dump a ton of cash in there to run people for board of supervisors. They just stand up and lie on TV, and the person running against them can't afford the TV commercial, so you lose. I mean, most of these
Yeah.
offices, they don't pay well. It's not like you're doing it as a career or something there. You're getting in because the lobbyists want you there and are going to make tons of cash from you being there. So
Yeah.
our voice just gets drowned out.
Well, funny enough, we have a current scandal going on in our board of supervisors, where one of the supervisors, named Alfredo Pedrosa, this one oligarch family called Catherine and Craig Hall, they threw the Buttigieg fundraiser in the wine cave. I don't know if you
Oh,
remember
I
that.
remember that.
These people, they've been trying to get this Walt Wines winery put in, and there's been a whole lot of protest against it, and it turns out that one of our supervisors, who's taken the most money from winery owners, um, he has him and his family have bought up 6 properties around where the Walt Wines is planned, and he's got his father named as the manager and his wife named as something else. And so he's all getting ready to enrich himself out of real estate. It's insider real estate.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah. I
so
don't.
gross. And now he's got to recuse himself. But the Board of Supervisors is so riddled with corruption, it's going to pass anyway. And he's going to get away with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's like we learned nothing from all the massive corruption in the 19th century when we used to go after a lot of the stuff. And we were like, hey, you know what? You shouldn't be able to bribe people in Congress. You shouldn't be able to like buy votes. I'm like, okay, we'll pass some laws. And then we just steadily erode them. And
Now
now
it's
you've
not
got
bribery
tons
anymore.
of people in Congress doing literal insider trading. They know what the policy is. They know what the laws are that they're going to pass. They know what's coming down the pipeline. They
Yeah.
make investments. They make a killing on it.
Yeah.
And like, we're not supposed to have an objection to that. I just
We
don't
weren't supposed to
understand that.
know about it.
Yeah, that's the problem. The media is so complicit in this entire neoliberal thing that they don't put a lot of effort into informing the public of just how corrupt our politics really are.
Yeah. Yeah.
The amount of money that goes into Washington, at least some people know that. It's honestly of of the kinds of things that helped to sway tons of independents into the Trump camp. Honestly, the whole drain the swamp thing really is a big one. It's a massive bipartisan issue. It's a massive issue with independents. We all know Washington is corrupt. They're not going to do anything about it. Trump literally brought the swamp with him, put lobbyists in charge of everything. No difference at all. It was just as bad as Reagan, but he
Yeah.
said it and it works. I don't understand why.
And people still believe it.
Yeah, why we
Still
can't
believe
get
it.
people, to really run on an issue like that and to do it sincerely. Because we used to have more of those. It shouldn't be that people like Bernie are so rare. And for all his flaws, I'm so glad that he's been there all along, constantly pointing these things out and like repeating the same points and critiquing this. Because we need more people able to do that.
Unfortunately, I never heard of him until 2015.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. No.
Yeah.
I honestly, that's most of the country. That's
Yeah,
really
I know it is.
Yeah.
But it's
Yep.
amazing, right? Because
Yeah.
he's been consistent, doing the same
Right.
thing, saying the same things.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
But
Yeah. I had friends a
no
lot on
media
the East
coverage.
Coast and I guess that helped a little bit there too. Because yeah, I remember, I remember when he first got in, and like as a freshman, he's like attacking the Gulf War and like, why shouldn't we be looking for a diplomatic solution? Why are we rushing to war on this? Whose interest does this actually serve? I'm like, oh hell yeah. But most of America is like, pays no attention at all. We just put our little yellow ribbons and all the fences and whatnot, and like, yeah, support the troops, and paid no attention to what we were doing and why we were there.
We are kept poor and busy.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, that's one of the single biggest reasons to keep salaries low in the U.S. is if you keep people scrounging to get by, they don't have time to pay attention to the deeper issues.
That's right.
And it really makes it's honestly a huge uphill battle for the progressive candidates to reach out to people, because not only do you have to like go and have those conversations, but then you're stuck actually trying to explain a position and how what they're hearing from the media just isn't real, that it's just a giant dog and pony show to distract us.
Yeah, and a lot of times you sound like a total lunatic saying
Right,
it.
exactly.
Yeah. No, I'm
it's so easy
sorry,
to be
but
like, oh, don't count that crazy wild-haired person. He's just some weird hippie. Like, no, we're just paying attention, and we're all getting screwed.
Yeah. Yeah, like the whole Ukraine thing. Like, some people actually believe that Russia has been planning this invasion all along, and Joe Biden is doing a graceful job navigating it. And it's like, you can't talk to these people. What are you talking to? You sound like an idiot. You sound like a Russian supporter.
Right. Yeah.
I'm a Putin supporter.
And Putin is a literal neo-fascist. There's nothing good about what he's doing, but how does that somehow make what the U.S. is doing good? Just because Putin bad doesn't make America good. We're both assholes.
We are.
It's so hard for people to kind of like get that, because they want the simple good guy versus bad guy, right? You want to see, okay, yes, Russia is destabilizing its neighbor. And yet that's like the US's whole shtick for the last 150 years.
More than that, you want to believe that you have a political party that's a good guy, and that the people you're voting for are good guys, and you're not voting for a bad guy.
Right.
It's really hard to crack that shell and like tell people who have been establishment Democrats all their lives, I'm sorry, but Hillary Clinton is corrupt. She really is.
Yeah. No,
or whoever.
I had those questions when first running for like the different club support. You mentioned clubs when we were talking earlier, and like trying to get attention in the Democratic clubs. And I remember those questions. It came up in like a little forum with like a speed question. You're like, yes or no, do you support Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House? No. And like people went, what? And it had to come back around later, and they had to ask, and like, okay, so why don't you? I'm like, okay, well, the last time she was in power, she completely bungled, the healthcare rollout in such a way that it immediately handed power to Republicans. She's not effective in any possible way, and is so deeply corrupt and tied into these moneyed circles there, that she's not paying attention to what we want. She's deliberately trying to sabotage what we want. And hell, oh gosh, did you see the new pact that like Hakeem Jeffries is putting together? I mean, he's a potential successor. They're trying to move him up in the hierarchy there, because they want people who will go after the progressives and support only the moneyed interests. this goes really, really deep in the party. And I think, honestly, most of the voting public doesn't really like it, but they're not aware of it. I think the people are, again, much farther left and far better than their party, and we're being led by assholes.
I think so too. And I think that some of those people who are farther left than they realize aren't even Democrats. Like, some of them are Republicans, but they're Republicans because they see Democrats
Absolutely.
as corrupt.
Right.
And yeah.
Yeah, and again, you get that whole partisan or tribal logic there that just shuts things down. You might have joined the party for one reason or another,
Sure
and then you just stick with it because you don't like the other side. But that means you're just not looking at the corruption on your own side.
Yeah.
Democrats will point to Republican corruption and ignore it in their own ranks, and vice versa. Republicans will point at Democratic corruption and ignore that Republicans are just as bad or worse.
And whichever party has control proves the other party right.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And the whole thing just cycles around. We were thinking earlier about the whole rush to war and this whole Ukraine thing, honestly, it's sad to see Republicans are more of a brake on a push toward conflict than Democrats are, solely because of Democrats in power, and they don't want a Democrat to be able to, to claim that, national defense sort of like shtick that they like. If their guy was in power, they'd be all over this.
Yes, absolutely.
It's like there's no real disagreement on the issues. They're all for the corporations. They're all for the banks. They're all for the military-industrial complex. The only thing they disagree on is, well, the other side's in power, so they're getting more donations than us.
Yes, or which country to target. We wanted to target Iran. No, we wanted to target Venezuela.
Right, exactly. Yeah,
I think there was some of that in the Trump years where they were. Yeah. It seemed like Trump didn't want to go after Iran. He wanted to go after Venezuela, and they kind of went back and forth, and they ended up going after Iran anyway.
Honestly, Trump brought us closer to really direct conflict with Iran than we have for a long time, and the logic behind all of it it's mind-boggling to me. The Iranian public overall is far more secular than the Arab Gulf world is. It's far better educated. It's a far more well-rounded economy anyway, and yet we have to go after them. We're always talking, oh, Iran is a state sponsor of terror. And like, okay, cool. So how many Iranians were involved in 9/11? How many Iranians are suicide bombers?
Right. And then when we bomb Syrians that are trying to get us out of their country, they're always Iranian-backed forces. Right. Or so if they attack us, we're going to bomb some Iraqis that are trying to get us out of their country, and we'll call them Iranian-backed forces. And then Joe Biden, he runs for office, and he says he's going to rejoin the JCPA. Mm-hmm. And does he? No, he comes at it just like Trump did, like a fucking bully.
That the Iranians don't want to do.
You better get back into this, or we're coming for you. It's the same shit Trump did.
Yeah, exactly. It's just the same crap, endlessly recycled. I mean, the JCPOA wasn't perfect, but it worked, and everyone was saying that they were complying with it. And then we pull out of it, and now it's impossible to get it back. And because we're out of it, it presents another opportunity for them to beat the drum, spend more money on the military because they need a useful enemy. Iran is just a useful enemy.
And interestingly, when we withdrew from the JCPA, we put sanctions on Iran for that. And my opponent voted for these sanctions. Why? What did Iran do that
Nothing.
Nothing.
They held up their side of it. We pulled out of it.
Yeah.
So what's the issue here? It's like we just need a useful enemy there, and I still, it blows me away that more Americans don't know. I mean, we've literally shot down an Iranian airliner full of like civilians and never apologized for it, but they're somehow a direct threat to us.
Right.
It's just an excuse to spend money, keep troops in the region. All you're doing is you're fueling a constant cycle of violence between Iran and the Gulf Arabs. We want to like arm the different sides. It's just like the Iran-Iraq war, where we wanted to like dump money into both sides, keep them fighting each other. It's just a giant scam to keep money pouring in the military-industrial complex. But if you follow this, so that we can point out the long-term foreign policy objectives, if you follow the money, if you see how it actually works and try to explain to people, it's still, there's like some kind of mental block that makes you sound like some kind of like crazy conspiracy theorist. Hello, we had government commissions talking about like the whole Iran-Contra thing, and like we know what we did.
Yes. And it's, it always seems to boil down to looting resources,
Mhm,
whether it's oil or lithium, or I hear Ukraine is loaded with resources.
mhm,
You know,
sure.
it's always the same old shit.
Right. It's getting cash in. I mean, it's honestly, it's sad the degree to which so much of what we're still dealing with was predicted over and over again. Like it's like the logic never really changes. I mean, hell, you had critiques going back, 100 years to like, people like, oh my gosh, you mentioned you were a socialist earlier, so I'll throw out Rosa Luxemburg here. I mean, she pointed out that what drives capitalism in Europe at the time, what drives Euro-American capitalism, is the rest of the world is constantly chasing those new markets, chasing those resources we basically need to manipulate these populations in order to maintain our own lifestyle. So it just has us in this endless cycle of imperialism. And
Yeah, it's
somehow
so
we're okay with
fucking
that.
sad, isn't it?
It's sad that
It's
somehow we can't
sad.
get. I mean, we used to have a pretty strong anti-imperialist league in the U.S. We had tons of people in the late 19th, early 20th century like, you know what, we shouldn't do that. And
Yeah.
today, if you raise that and you say maybe we shouldn't spend 770 billion a year on guns, you're like, oh my god, what do you want? Like the terrorists to win?
Yeah.
Like what? We got two giant oceans and two friendly neighbors. What are you afraid of?
Or maybe we shouldn't put sanctions on other countries because we're making life harder for poor people.
Yeah, we're only
you
hurting
know?
ordinary people. And you know what drives me nuts about the sanctions? And some people did point out, okay, the death toll in Iraq, the way it hurt ordinary people, but they'll still defend it. The problem here, and this is one of the things I loved, at least Chomsky was pointing to this, but almost no one else was, the sanctions actually strengthened Saddam Hussein. So if you're saying
Yes.
Saddam bad, and I get that, yes, he gassed Kurds, blah blah blah, like terrible person, but the sanctions made the people dependent upon him to distribute the few resources that were available. So it strengthened the government.
That's true.
I mean,
And not only that, like in the case of Venezuela, we have these crippling sanctions on Venezuela. It makes Maduro the head of the people who's against U.S. imperialism.
right,
They don't want us there, and so he's their defender. We've made
right.
him their defender. We did that.
Yeah, it's honestly, it's the same thing with like Castro and some countless other people here. You want to say,
Yes.
okay, this is bad. And like, yay, hey, I'm with you there. Authoritarianism is bad. Maduro's mismanaging the country. I get that. But people are going to love him because we are screwing Venezuela over. It
Yes.
just consolidates support around these. And honestly, is they never talk about this, but that really is what's driving a lot of the policy positions, is that it's actually beneficial to us to maintain these antagonisms. We have to maintain the sanctions on Cuba because it funnels money to the defense complex. We have to maintain Iran as an enemy, Venezuela as an enemy. It just keeps this endless cycle going.
Yeah.
I mean, if we weren't pushing people around, what possible enemies would we have? Is anyone seriously going to argue? I mean, do you remember like Reagan saying that like, well, we can't allow like Grenada or Nicaragua to go like socialist because then tanks are only like a 2-day drive to Texas. I mean, are you kidding? Nicaragua's going to invade the US? Really? Really? I mean, we're going to use Grenada as a launching point for an invasion of the US. I mean, who believes this?
Grenada's not big enough for a launching point.
Right. Nicaragua isn't big enough. Hell, in
No.
like the 1840s, Mexico lost a war to the US. Do you think anybody would invade from Central America? But somehow, if you talk about this, the fear mongering around it is so powerful, I think.
Yeah.
It's like, and this is one of the things that frustrates me about Democrats as the so-called opposition to Republicans, is that the Republicans are much more blunt in their fear mongering, because the right generally is, but Democrats completely surrender to that logic. And they're willing to go along with so much of that because they ultimately don't want to criticize the money that's flowing to all those companies. So you end up
Democrats have their share of fear mongering too, though.
They do, absolutely.
Fear
They often have,
Russia,
as you
fear
say, different
Trump,
targets.
fear Trump supporters.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
They're gonna end our democracy.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's you shift the targets around a little bit, but
Yeah.
ultimately it doesn't change anything. Oh, vote for Biden, that will somehow protect our democracy. Well,
Doesn't change.
hello, the whole neoliberal turn is what enabled the right to turn explicitly fascist here. You know, if they hadn't been doing that, I mean, people like Biden made Trump inevitable.
Yeah.
You know, so electing him doesn't fix the
And
problem.
he hasn't changed a whole lot of policies either.
No,
No.
essentially nothing. You know, and
No.
I mean, even the immigrant detention facilities, everything, keeping people in Mexico, all the horrible shit that the media and Democrats were like, Trump bad, because you know they're keeping people in Mexico and firing tear gas. And I'm like, okay, so now Biden does it, and it's no longer front page news.
Right. Right. And it's the same with universal health care, right? They were all, we're going to fight for universal health care. We have to have single payer now. We have to have single payer now. And then when Joe Biden gets elected, Joe Biden doesn't support it. And so we're going to not fight for single payer anymore, even though we're in a pandemic and people are dying. Now we'll fight to expand Medicare to include optometry and hearing aids and dental, which is good. I
Yeah,
mean,
it's something.
absolutely. I would love to see just the dental, but we stopped fighting for universal health care.
And they'll blame things like the filibuster, or the president say, well, Biden would veto it, so we can't do it, or they'll just filibuster it in the Senate, which again,
Or
it's
the
all excuse
parliamentarian.
that they want. Everyone wants to maintain that filibuster there so that they can use it as an excuse to not actually deliver on any promises. So we repeat the same promises over and over. People were promising universal health care and even a basic income back in the 1960s. And we're still sitting there like, okay, are you ever going to do anything? Oh, no, they'll just veto it. Like, okay, solve that problem then.
We're going to have to fire the corporate employees in Congress first.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. And honestly, this is one of the craziest things about using Biden as an excuse. If Democrats pass by an overwhelming majority a single payer bill, would a Democratic president veto his own Congress? He's not going to do it.
He vowed to.
He could, but you have the power to pressure people to do that, because it can affect their reelection. Realistically, if Democrats canceled student debt, they wouldn't lose the House. If they passed single payer, they wouldn't lose the House. The fact that they're not going to do anything almost guarantees Republicans will make gains this year.
If they legalized cannabis.
Yeah, it'd be something.
Especially in a way that helped the communities that have been affected by its criminalization.
Yeah, the aggressive policing for allow local businesses to step in. Oh yeah.
Yeah, they won already if they did that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that if they actually made a difference in ordinary people's lives, that so many younger voters, poor voters, whatever, we would come out and support them.
Yep.
And if you don't deliver, all it does is it encourages people to stay home, and then you're committed, single issue voters will come out and Republicans can sweep. And then every time, you mentioned like the Democrats do their own fear mongering. Yeah, exactly. They do. It's a different type of fear mongering, but it's the same thing. Oh, you got to vote for me because the other guy's worse.
Yeah.
Like, cool. Yeah, I totally get the other guy's much worse, but what are you going to do? And that, I think, is an important question. So
yeah,
I think the good one to kind of like wind down on here is just to ask, like, so if we're going to back you, if we want to support you for office, because I love supporting candidates like you, would you commit to holding these parties accountable, to like talking about their records, to making them do something?
Let me see now. Yes, absolutely.
Kind of an easy one, isn't it?
That is like the number one thing that people ask me. When you get into office, they're looking at my platform on my postcard. Are you going to be able to get this done? And I say, realistically, no. Most of Congress is against that. But what I can do is say the truth and call it out and have press conferences and whatever the hell I have to do. Hey, these guys are saying they're in favor of your health care, but they're voting against it.
Exactly.
And gee, could it be because of all those big insurance donors?
Yeah. And those voices do change things. If you can get attention in the media, if you can talk about issues, honestly, okay, you mentioned like the Bernie was kind of, didn't even exist for you before 2015. It's because he ran for president. Chances of him winning were almost nil because of the way the party structures things, but he mainstreamed things like Medicare for all. We're now talking about it again where we hadn't been for decades.
Yeah.
And those small voices, if you get people into office, they can hold people to the fire. You can introduce things into the record. You can speak out on C-SPAN. You can get clips to go viral talking about this stuff. and that can change the conversation, get more people elected. If we get more people, like you into office, then yeah, we can change things. That's the struggle.
Especially if you get a significant social media following like AOC does. She has like what, 12 million followers on Twitter.
Right. It gives her a platform.
And I definitely have some pretty strong criticisms of AOC, but she's also gotten some really important things put out there.
I agree. I have my criticisms of all of them, but anybody that's actually willing to stand up for ordinary people and push these ideas, it helps to change the conversation. The fact that she can show up on CNN or whatever and talk about issues, it helps.
Yeah, it sure does.
And I'd really love to see more people kind of like pushing back against the whole tribalism too. I honestly, again, I love that this last time around, Bernie went on Fox and he did that town hall on Fox, and an audience predisposed to conservative positions was like applauding him.
Voting for, they were all like, yeah, I'm in favor of Medicare for all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's really the corporate money that stops us from getting anything done, not the voters. Voters would line up to support these positions if only the politicians had the balls to actually push them forward and get us talking about this stuff. So if we're going to support you in your run this time around, do you have a website, place for donations, anything you can direct us to?
Yeah, my website is Kishineff.com, just like my name. I should have, I gotta just double check and make sure. Just gotta have a donor button there. It's been a while since I visited it. yeah, it's got a donate button there. But the direct donate link is paypal.com/PayPalMe/Jason Kishineff, if you want to go directly there. But the website itself is Kishineff.com.
Yeah, because realistically, that's the only way we ever get any voices out there. It's the only way we get heard. And whether somebody wins or loses, ultimately, if you have enough resources coming in, if you're able to get your message out there, sometimes you can push the people who do win. You can get them to adopt your positions on there. I mean, this happens constantly. So if you care about these issues, if anybody cares about the issues that Jason is running on here, helping his campaign can help bring these issues to the fore, and it can actually make a difference. Okay, so
thank you, Liam.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. So, any closing thoughts, or we can wind down here?
Closing thoughts. The main reason that I decided to run for office in the first place, was obviously getting corporate money out of our political system, but my main driver is ending state-sponsored violence. That includes police violence. It includes support of Israel. That needs to end. We need to be supporting Palestinians. We need to be supporting freedom in that region. No matter, let it be up to the people, right? What the country's name is going to be and how things are going to be. But there needs to be freedom and democracy there. Mm-hmm. And that gets characterized by Zionists a lot as you want Israel wiped off the map. But that's bullshit. We just want equality. Right. And I'm going to end with that.
Yeah, exactly. Let people vote. Realistically, if we claim to care about democracy, human rights, freedom, whatever, then we have to get the corporate money out of our politics because it lets them buy elections. And we have to stop interfering in struggles all around the world. We're constantly propping up terrible governments and working against the interests of freedom, democracy, and human rights.
That is U.S. foreign policy.
Make like some polite noises about it.
That is U.S. foreign policy right there.
Yeah,
international piracy,
democracy, basically.
International piracy. That's our foreign policy.
Yeah, and it shouldn't be. And talking about this, and this is another place where the message often gets lost. There, that doesn't mean you don't like America. Quite the opposite. It means you love Americans and you want us to stop being the bad guys internationally.
Right.
We like to point out, hey, other countries don't like us. We should be afraid. Maybe if we weren't doing some of the things that we're doing, we wouldn't be held up as a threat to peace.
Maybe not spending money on killing Palestinians or killing Venezuelans or killing Iranians or killing Ukrainians and spending that on healthcare and education is putting America first.
Oh my goodness. Maybe if we just cared about the American people, instead of like, I don't know, let's help the Saudis commit war crimes. I don't know. Maybe we'd all be better off somehow.
I don't know. You
Or
sound
people
like a
would die
fucking
in Yemen
Assadist, Liam.
and we'd be
Are you
better
an
off.
Assad supporter now?
What was that?
I said you sound like an Assad supporter now.
Again, that's one of the funny things. It's just like with the rhetoric around Putin. I mean, Assad is terrible. His father was terrible. It's a horrifying government. But are we supposed to be there? Are we actually helping anybody? No, we're not making anything better.
We are starving Syrians. We are keeping them from reconstructing their country, and we are driving them to embrace Assad.
Right, exactly. It makes Assad stronger. We keep essentially propping up these dictatorships through terrible foreign policy, and then just point to the dictators as if they're the problem.
Yes.
I mean, if you cut this crap out, people would be able to reform or overthrow their own governments again. And we should honestly be embracing that. But still, hell, we haven't gotten over the Iranians overthrowing our pet dictator in the 70s. We're still mad about that. Like, come on, really? Let people choose their own form of government. That used to be an American value. We used to talk about self-determination of peoples. We don't anymore.
I read something that was interesting where it said that we wanted Iran to be our Israel in the region. We wanted them to be our base where we use them to attack the other countries and keep them destabilized. Mm-hmm. And that didn't work out too well. And so
no, we lost that. So it got us in love with the Saudis.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just looking for a proxy in the area.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Israel, that was the thing I read was about Israel.
Well, yeah.
1967 war and all that.
All right. Okay, so we don't want to keep people dragging this out forever, but honestly,
yeah, I think we could talk for like a week.
All night. I think you could too.
Yeah.
But this has been great. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
And if you guys are interested in any of this, please support Jason, help him out here, help him get his message out in his area, and push back against the corruption in Napa.
Thank you, man.
Have a good night.
You too.